Are we on?
We are here. We are live.
Periscope.
We're doing Periscope today instead of Facebook Live. Seeing if...
Take that, Facebook.
Yeah, take that. Look at you all shaving and stuff. Look, I grew some. You were shaving.
Well...
What does that say up there?
Oh, click here at any time to view the posts on Periscope.
Ooh, I could view the posts. Click there.
So...
Yeah, do you introduce... I'm going to click the thing so we can maybe see it on the screen if anybody...
This is Off the Cuff with Ward Crocker, Joe Miller, and Leroy Hill.
Okay, I'm going to do that.
Ward Crocker is not with us again this week.
Again?
And that's a good thing for you, simply because Ward is kind of boring.
Oh, man. When he comes back, he's going to...
I don't even care. I'm not scared of Ward. I am not scared of you, Ward.
So,
He's 60.
So we have to introduce ourselves to this, to our... we're starting our PhD stuff this fall in the cohort. Like we have to do these form introductions, and so I'm saying, hey, I'm connected with, Ward and Corey because they're both starting,
Right?
And so my intro is this. It's like, hey, we're starting this cohort with Ward Crocker and Corey Marsh. I said, Corey doesn't already have another doctorate, but we still like him anyway. So I'm actually going to put that in my introduction.
You should put that in your intro.
I am. That's actually, I wrote it out.
Corey is, we have to treat Corey with kid gloves,
Yeah,
He's just a kid.
He'll only have one doctorate.
Just one. But it'll be an important one.
Psh, whatever.
Who
doesn't have one?
I don't.
It's like that Big Bang joke. It's like, you ever see that one? Like,
I know exactly the one you're talking about.
Well, I always give Wolowitz trouble because he doesn't have a PhD. He's like, I have 2 masters, and Sheldon turns to him and says, "Who doesn't?"
Yeah, exactly.
Oh gosh!
Oh my gosh!
Well, you got some good stuff. I have some themes. You can do yours. I'll tease mine out because I have a theme I would like to maybe think about because I have a collection of like 3 or 4 things all aimed at dads. Like, what does it mean to be a dad?
Oh, did you see the
Daddy.
article written in the Wall Street Journal? In case you haven't read it, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal that is on, and I think I'll post it here later, that is on why a dad matters to his daughter. Probably one of the best articles ever written.
See, that would be great. We'll bring it up, and we'll maybe I'll try to link to all these.
Yeah.
When I archive the
one of the best. It came out last week. It's one of the best articles ever on what a dad, why a masculine dad really aids his daughter in her identity as a woman. It was just a great article.
That's interesting. So we'll get to that. I mean, I don't want to. We'll tease into that. I don't know. It looked like you had.
I have one thing, and it's kind of cool. Yesterday, I had a meeting. I won't say with who. I mean, where I won't name drop or anything like that. But I met yesterday with the mayor of one of the cities, one of the larger cities in this area. And this mayor was interested in developing something like Socrates in the Cities, which is what I talked to you about the other day.
Yeah, I looked at that link to that. It's funny because for years, like when I planted my first church in Washington, one of the things I wanted to do was set up a community forum, essentially, where you just get 3 or 4 experts, a difference of opinion, invite the community to talk about issues that are challenging facing the community, and it's really hard to do those things because to get like people to back those things, not financially, but not just even philosophically to want to do that.
Right, because
it's hard. It's harder than you think.
It is because you have. I think he really wanted to work through pastors, but I think what happens with many pastors, not all, is their vision really doesn't spread outside of their church.
Which is why, as a church planter, I had that mentality because I knew that was a way to connect with people. Yeah. Right. I mean,
so their vision really doesn't expand outside of their church, and a lot of pastors are hesitant to do things with other pastors because they're not as sure what the other pastors, or they're doubtful about what the other pastor's vision is. So
they're worried about protecting the flock,
right. And it's very interesting because we're taking this class right now. We're working through Christ and Culture Revisited using D.A. Carson's book. I read. I believe it's Richard Niebuhr. Not Richard is
the Christ.
He's the same one.
Reinhold
is the insane one.
Reinhold's the Marxist one.
Right. So Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture, which is a fabulous book. But what Richard does in his book is he takes this look at the culture, and he tries to paint a portrait for the reader to see, not to tell you which approach to take.
He gives 5 approaches to connecting Christ and culture.
Exactly, but he doesn't try to tell you which approach to take. He just tries to explain how each approach will affect the culture, or be seen in the culture, or be worked out in the culture. So, with that against the backdrop, as we were meeting yesterday, I was really struck by this guy's heart, which was to lower the rhetoric, to lower the anger and the hostility between people who have opposing views, so that the good of the city, something good can be done for the city, which was really remarkable. And that was really his heart. He didn't care whether there were left people or right people that would be involved. He just wanted people whose passion was for the good of the city. So, I left that meeting yesterday, was really struck by it. And then I get to the office, and I'm lunchtime, and I'm working at lunch. And I saw this interview yesterday with Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
Oh, okay.
She's the White House press briefer. She's the White House press correspondent. And, she does battle with the press, the national press, every day. And boy, there's like a 3-minute video where one of the media, the CNN media guys, asks her, "Is the press the enemy of the people?" Well, she responds with a litany of answers that really shows how the press, who are supposed to be objective, aren't really objective, and how they're just as responsible for ratcheting up the tension. And she doesn't really answer his question, but he comes back a second time and says, "You've told us how you feel, but is the press really the enemy of the people?" And then she gives him another pat answer and says, "I've already told you what the president has to say. I'm not going to say anything further on the answer."
Yeah, she's not supposed to.
And I thought to myself, wow. Is the press the enemy of the people? And when you look at the question and you really try to consider whether the press is the enemy of the people.
If I were her, you know how to answer that? Like, given the answer that you said she gave with describing, this is how the press is biased and stuff, I would answer this. To the degree that description is accurate, that the press only reflects one political view,
yes,
is the degree that they are the enemy of the people. To the degree that view is inaccurate, they are not.
That is,
you can decide for yourself. You don't have to decide if you are the enemy of the people. We're just telling you we believe where the bias is, and to the degree that that's true, that's the concept. That's what it is. But everyone else has to decide.
And it's a great point that you bring up, because
I'm surprised she didn't say it.
She didn't say that.
She's a really bright gal.
What she brought up was the press's abdication of their responsibility. Yes, the president is mean to them. Yes, the president picks on them. Yes, the president, treats them unfairly. Let's say he does all of that. Let's grant it. But their job is to be objective. That's the duty that they owe us as the press, to report objectively and fairly. But they do not. They do not. In this article, it's articles from the Washington Post, and I won't read it all, but I thought it was interesting as I read this article, because the writer wanted to say something like, "Wow, the White House's official policy is the press is the enemy of the people." But as I read through the article, I couldn't help but notice the language that she used in order to characterize Sarah Huckabee Sanders' actions. She didn't take a middle of the road to say that, there's unfairness on both sides. She didn't take a middle of the road approach to say, we could do better, and we're going to ask you.
The press, you're saying.
The press.
Her response, yeah.
Her response wasn't to say, we, the press, can do better, and we're going to ask you to do better. But it was to point out Sarah Sanders, to say, Sarah Sanders looked down at her notes, and appeared to read a prepared statement about her perceived grievances with the media.
Which is her job.
Exactly.
As if like that disqualifies what she said.
Exactly. How, among other things, she was cruelly made fun of, which is true, at the Springs White House Correspondents' Dinner. The association, and they put in there, the association said Michelle Wolf's performance was not in the spirit of the mission of promoting free press. She said, I mentioned Sarah's reading of her notes because it's a telling detail. She had something ready to go on this. It suggests she knew she was going to be asked about Trump's view on the media. She had talked about it with the president.
Shocking, because they never asked.
Because they never asked. And they decided not to back down, as if they should back down.
Yeah.
If you watch the news, and if you've been a news watcher for the last 3, 4, 5
years.
Her
criticism of him is they know that we criticize it, and they were prepared. How dare
they prepare?
How dare they be prepared?
But the thing is, what's interesting to me, I think there's 3 data points that we need to consider. The first data point is, look at the last year of how the press treated George W. Bush. And he didn't fight back.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they savaged him for a whole year.
And he talked about that. He's talked about that after. He said, no, my actions will speak for themselves. I'm not there to defend myself. I'm the president. I am above that. The president is above that. The dignity of the president, I cannot respond.
When he was saying it sounded good. I remember. It sounded really good. But what happened afterward?
And Trump fights back, and he's undignified.
Exactly. But what happened afterward, where we had 8 years of just, however you want to characterize the last 8 years, and the Republican Party suffered in elections because of that. And Trump, when he came in, that's the first data point. The second data point is Sean Spicer's initial press conference. Have you ever seen it?
His first one?
His first one. I challenge you.
I haven't watched TV news in a long time.
I challenge you.
I see some clips. But.
Go to YouTube. They've preserved it. Go to YouTube. For now. And later. And watch Sean Spicer's first interview with the press. It was probably about an 8-minute. In this 8 minutes, he took a blowtorch to their faces, and he took an iron pipe to their kneecaps, and didn't even let them ask any questions, and walked off. I thought to myself, oh my gosh. He literally just went in there and just went at them. And that has been their tenor, which is a mistake. I mean, as gleeful as it was to see them get sort of a comeuppance, it's been a mistake. That was a mistake. They should have had a more artful approach, taken a more firm but velvet glove approach to them. But that's just
firm but inartful is a good description.
It was firm and inartful.
Many of their approaches,
right? And that is.
I heard on the radio when I was driving home yesterday some of Trump's, like, one of his rallies.
Oh yeah.
And there's just some clips. I really actually had to turn the station. I mean, he is so difficult to listen to. Some of the things he says are so
outlandish.
Just, I mean, it's just painful to listen to. Anyway, but that comes across sometimes. But
and the third point was this interview with where Acosta. Now, if you know anything about Jim Acosta is the most preening peacock in the absolute world. He is not what you think a White House press correspondent ought to be. Your White House press correspondent. He works
for which outlet?
CNN,
right?
Yeah. But your White House press correspondent is the guy who is above reproach, carries himself with a demeanor. He represents, on the national stage, your organization. And if that's the guy who you put there, Mr. Preening Peacock, you're not really saying much. I mean, it's just but anyway. When he asked that question, he got up out of the news briefing before it was over, and he said that he was saddened and he left exasperated. And I wanted to say, you're as much responsible for this tension as they are.
As bad as Trump is and all that stuff and dealing with those, and I think awkward, and I mean, I don't mind that he fights back, but he does it so
viciously.
Yeah, just
viciously.
But the truth is, the press isn't above reproach, as you're saying. I mean, they're just as bad. They're just a little bit more artful in it because they've had so much practice for so many years. But they're not that much more, especially when you watch them do it live. Yeah. In their articles, they're more refined, but the editors get a hold of it and they refine it.
It's just, I was miserable. You look at the tone in our country.
That's why I just don't even watch that stuff.
You look at the tone in our country today.
I get nothing from it.
Yeah. It's sad. It's sad. I mean, as much as we want, the press to be free, and we want the press to be free. We want you to report the news, whether you're on the left or the right, objectively and fairly. I think that's what we deserve as a nation, regardless of whether you like the president or dislike the president. Report on him fairly. Step out of the way and step out of the spotlight. If that guy wants to be, mean spirited, then you can't be if you're the press.
If you want to know a good perspective on what the press should be. From somebody in a modern context, if anybody hasn't done it, look at Alexander Solzhenitsyn's speech
at Harvard.
To Harvard.
Oh.
And he talks about the nature of what it means for a press to lose that status of impartiality and to be sort of embroiled in the taking those sides and the destructive nature of that. So if anybody, I mean, we don't have to go. Schultz needs this whole thing, but I think I wrote a post on it years ago on my blog.
I might look at that
last
today.
Year or something.
What's
fascinating?
What's interesting is the last thing I say about it. It's very interesting is this. I think when Trump came into office, he surveyed the landscape, and he looked at Schumer and Pelosi, and just saw in his mind he thinks that they're lightweights. He doesn't think that they're the real enemy, and I think politically, he's right. They're not Harry Reid. They're not Harry Reid, who was no lightweight. But I think he looks at them politically and says that they're not the people I need to be afraid of. It's the press that I need to be afraid of because they're carrying the water for them. And they
cover their gaffes.
He's decided to take an axe to that tree. And that's why that's part of the reason why we're in, this
and that's the thing is, I don't want the press to carry Trump's water. I just don't want them to carry the other side's water either.
I don't want them to carry any water at all. I just want to carry the truth.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. I mean, it was.
So here's my question. That's an interesting little political discussion in the press and where it goes. But here's my question. It's a question I used to ask years ago when I was a youth pastor, and
you were smart.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know if I was ever that. I'm still not sure I am. But anyway.
Whatever.
But a lot of our youth kids were dealing with, because of some of the circumstances in our lives, the idea of, gay marriage and what that meant.
Sure.
And this was still, this is a long time ago. So this is before it was legal anywhere, before it was
before it was a topic.
Yeah, before it was a topic. It was still, went on for a while locally, and I'm sure all over the country in many places before it became an issue. But we were dealing with that. And one of the questions to some of them who were trying to think through, like, well, as long as kids have two loving parents, what does it matter? These are the kind of issues. And I'd say, so if you say that's true, one of the questions I ask them is, which parent doesn't matter, moms or dads? Because if there's two dads, you're saying moms don't matter. You're saying there's two moms in a situation, you're saying dads don't matter. And so I'd sort of ask them that, like, tell me which one you think doesn't matter to a kid. And so we try to wrestle through that way. And that's where we've talked before about the importance of dads in that article you mentioned. But here's one that's interesting. This study, this one is out of Australia, I believe, is where it originally came, or no, South Africa. So this study from South Africa says families shouldn't aim to have dads living at home. In other words, it's not an important goal to have a dad at home with the kids. That's what this study is wanting to prove. So here it is out of South Africa. This is on LifeSite News. They say, a father living at home with his wife to raise their children should not be considered normal, according to a report on fatherhood in South Africa. The quote, a father living with his biological children on a daily basis should not be seen as a norm to which all families should aspire, since it is simply not feasible or desirable in all cases. What do you think about that premise? Here's what they say. I'll think about this more. They said, there are many types of families. Now, I'll give you a hint. They equivocate terms here and making their case, and it's important. There are many types of fathers and many types of fatherhood in South Africa. The Snoke Gender Justice Organization maintained on their website.
The
Sanki Gender Justice Organization.
There's a hint there.
Yeah. The Sanki Gender Justice Organization. There are biological fathers, social fathers, gay fathers, straight fathers, young fathers, older fathers. We have self-identified fatherhood, ascribed fatherhood, long-distance fatherhood, and proximal fatherhood.
The equivocation,
to name only a few.
Yeah, the equivocation here is on the adjective. The ontological role of father is still the same, but they're attempting to characterize that ontological role by giving it some other characteristic. But the role of father is still there, even if the time spent or the character of the father is good or bad, it is still there.
So here's what they're saying is, this is where also they confuse us. So they say because there's differences in how people do fathering,
right?
Therefore, no one can say there's an ideal of what fatherhood should be. And within their worldview, I understand it because they don't have any sort of outside.
There's no anchor points in their worldview. There's no anchor
points. So, it's all equal. Every culture is equal. Every viewpoint's equal. Right. There's no equality. Right. So they say, applying the measure to all South African families of ideal of one, mom and dad being home together, dad living at home being an ideal, not only overlooks the social fathering that happens, but presents a negative view of extended families, which are mostly black. So in other words, you're racist if you think it's racist to say that dad should be at home, because you're really just saying it's really of a subtle way of the culture judging black people is essentially what I'm arguing. Right,
because anytime you can throw a minority into the equation, man, you can really switch it for your side.
Yeah.
Anytime a minority is being viewed as being vilified or pilloried or punished, that's a plus for your argument.
Yeah.
But the whole point of that, of even the statement that you read, was again meant to diminish what it means to be a father. Now, when we think of father, and I'm not trying to even draw an equivocation here, because look, particularly, and I just had this conversation yesterday. It's really interesting. Is this morning I was driving to work with taking my son-in-law to get an RV. And we talked about, how in the 70s when I grew up, having a dad at home was normal. It was a normal thing. 60s, 70s, you had a dad at home. Only until the late 70s, early 80s did you start to see less dads at home. And what that produced was a family structure that was incredibly weak. 1930s, you look at the census from the 1930s up until the 1960s, and what you found in black families are multiple generations living under the same roof. Yeah. It was just normal up until the late 60s, late 60s, early 70s. It was a normal thing. Then in the early 70s, what you started to see was this real switch where the families really began to disintegrate because of the separation between the mom and dad, and a lot of it was because people impoverished, was welfare. But here was a very interesting thing. What that produced in the 80s was these unnatural homes. Unnatural. I mean, what I mean by unnatural, what I mean is disjointed ways of seeing family, where you have baby mamas and baby daddies. You have multiple baby daddies and multiple baby mamas. And those are the norm, but the rarity is a single mom and a single dad together raising their children. That's the rarity.
Yeah, well, here, listen to this number, because it says in South Africa, only 36% of children 17 years of age younger lived with their biological fathers in 2016. Another 35% lived with an adult man who is not their biological father. Mm-hmm. So, and then it compares to Canada and U.S. and where those numbers are. But before we get to too much like the importance of fathers, I think just observing that whole argument is being made that dads don't matter. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter because you can have one far away, whatever. Because there's an equivocation of terms of what that means, we cannot have an ideal, therefore, to have one who's far away or close by or living or married or single or whoever it is. Doesn't matter. Let's just say dads aren't that important. It's just the kids, as long as they're loved. Matter of fact, LA Times last week. Here's the second bit of data. So the LA Times last week reported a study which answers this long question that has been going around. Do children living with same-sex adults do just as well as kids raised by their mother and father in all important measures of healthy child well-being? So that's sort of the question. Like, again, with my youth kids we dealt with years ago, that question is still around. And basically, the LA Times last week reported that researchers find, quote, no difference between kids raised by two moms and kids raised by mom and a dad. The story cited a new article published in the esteemed New England Journal of Medicine. But the problem is that no such really study exists, and they unpack this and go into it and really just say that these are politically motivated groups with political agendas who are just writing stuff that gets approved, that gets reprinted and gets published without really revealing what their data sources are, without longitudinal evidence to back up all the data, because they're political reports, not scientific reports. And because there's an agenda. Dads, like in South Africa, don't normalize the idea of a mom and dad. That's terrible. That's evil because you're really dehumanizing. It's really hurts other people.
You're stigmatizing those people who haven't grown up with those situations.
And more important, we don't even need that.
Right.
More important, so you look at the direction the culture is going. I think that's very interesting.
Well, there's a book called Soft Patriarchs, New Men by a guy named Bradford Wilcox. You should pick it up and read it if you're interested in this topic. And the thesis of his book is that the evangelical Christian male is the ideal father that the world, so to speak, is looking for. Particularly men raised in the current generation. And he marshals a lot of data to prove his point. And his point is, if you consider what the egalitarian family is looking for, they're looking more for a dad who's not the dictator king of his house. He's more of the supervisor that kind of helps you achieve your life's goal and mission, that sort of thing. And he argues that this new evangelical dad that they're seeing through the data is somewhat gives you that world or that perspective, but he's also a guy who is masculine and has values, and he's necessary for the family.
Now, here's what's interesting about what your point is there, and this ties into a couple little stories I want to get, because the next couple stories deal with actual genetics issues of genetic and biological fatherhood. And the idea that dads are really more than their DNA, or more than DNA. They're not just DNA donors. They're more than that. And you're talking about social things like what they provide.
Sure.
The thing is, what new studies showing us is that there's actually a closer connection between fatherhood and the nature of a dad, who he is actually, and the genetic makeup and well-being long-term of a baby that actually come together in the actual fertilization process. So it's like turning genetics on its head. So this is the first one. The title of this one is called Dads Pass on More Than Genetics in Their Sperm. So I'm going to use some words that might be offensive to some people, like sperm. And I will say the word ejaculation at one point.
Okay.
So
you just got it out there.
So, yeah.
You kind of warned everybody.
Let the kids leave the room before they hear me say that word.
Right.
Oh, wait. I already said it, though. So that wasn't much of a warning, was it? I'll have to practice how to do the right warnings.
His name is Joe Miller. Let me give you his phone number.
You can reach me at the address below right there. All right. So I'm also going to use the word semen. Okay. But this word is seminal. It means original. I think that's ironic that that's what they use that. I think they did that on purpose.
Right.
Seminal research, or maybe it's seminal. I don't know. Maybe because they're actually researching semen. Maybe I pronounced stupid. So research reveals that sperm change their cargo as they travel the reproductive tract, and the difference can have consequences for fertility. So in other words, Mendelian genetics, since we've got, for 60 years now, roughly, or so, 70 years, really argues that our DNA, that mom and dad get together, they each have half of this DNA strand, half from dad, half from mom. They come together, the sperm brings one half, the egg is the other half. They merge. Oh, there's a brand new, person created out of that. If you're a Christian person, some people say that it's not a person, but we won't argue that right now. We'll just say, hey, that's a brand new person created. But that's not actually totally true. So here's what it says. Eat poorly, and your body will remember, and possibly pass the consequences on to your kid. Now, we know that mothers, like what they say when they eat, like alcohol fetal syndrome, can have an impact. But what they're realizing that this is actually, the importance of this is that data over time has realized that there's really what's called epigenetic information.
Let me say
information beyond the genes that determine the destiny of the kid.
I can see slightly the argument. I mean, I can see tendrils.
But wait, there's more.
Go ahead.
There's new, but see, this is not just that. There's more to it. This is really interesting because these are new findings. So, in the past several years, mounting evidence has shown the sperm can take note of a father's lifestyle decisions and transfer his baggage to offspring. Today, there's two complementary studies. Scientists tell us how. As sperm travels the male reproductive system, they jettison and acquire non-genetic cargo that fundamentally alters sperm before ejaculation. These modifications not only communicate the father's current state of well-being, but can also have dramatic consequences on the viability of future offspring. Now, here's the control on this. In vitro fertilization, which is, the process where they take this, because people can't get pregnant, they take the sperm and they, in a lab, put it inside an egg, and then they put it inside the mom, or you have, say a surrogate mom who does these sort of things. But through most of that process, they get the sperm from the male, they go into a room and say, hey, give me a sample, and they do it. But in some cases, men can't do that, and they actually directly remove the sperm that has not traveled through this little 2-week journey to get, because it takes a couple weeks for the sperm to mature. It travels through the epididymis, I guess is the word, but, I don't want to get too technical in the details. Anyway, so the point is it's through that process, that 2-week process, it's getting rid of information, and it's adding information to the sperm that are related to the life of the current circumstances of the dad. So what they've done this, and they've taken this in this process where the sperm has not been through that process, it actually has an impact on the fertilization of the sperm. So the whole point is that this idea of epigenetics, the things that we do, and I won't give too much more except this last line of this one. It says, the legacy of a dad's behavior can even live on in his child if the epigenetic elements enter the embryo.
So
think about that.
So here's me, at least as you were talking, here's what I figured. In the same way that some people are born with a proclivity, or in other words, not a proclivity, but they'll can be affected by alcohol very easily, right? Some people Indians, for example, are have been known to pass that trait on to their children.
Here's the difference, though.
But I'm making a different case.
Okay, just to clarify this. The assumption has been that has been a genetic transfer, like through DNA.
Right.
What this is showing is that some of that is not genetic in terms of DNA.
It's just lifestyle. Right. That's what I'm getting at. So it is possible. I mean, is it possible that your lifestyle, whatever that is, can so affect your body such that it changes the way your DNA functions, even your sperm cells as they're formed? Is that what you're getting at?
It doesn't change.
Not that it functions, but the features.
Okay. So it doesn't. Just to be clear, I mean, I don't want to get too bogged down in details, but it doesn't change the genetic code itself.
Right.
But
it has to carry some epigenetic markers, though.
Yeah. Think about it this way. This is one of the examples they gave in one of these articles. If you have a stereo system and you got all this stuff, you can change the knobs, the gain, the volume. Sure. You can change the bass and the treble.
And that's what I'm getting at.
Epigenetic information is like all the stuff is there in genes, but epigenetics changes like maybe
what if
the impact certain genes have on the life.
That makes sense.
It might turn certain signals on or
off. Right? That makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, I could see
volume.
Imagine if you are susceptible to, let's say, not drugs, because drugs is an easy thing. But let's say to a specific kind of food that you eat in a given area. I mean, is it possible that affects the way that you think? It affects the way that your body functions, not your DNA so much, but the way your body functions, and it turns off and turns on certain markers.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not hard to believe.
That tells us that what it means to be a dad is not just being a DNA donor,
right?
A sperm donor. Because my lifestyle choices, the things that I do, are passed on through this process of maturity within the sperm itself. We're finding that those. Let's put it this way. I'll go a little bit beyond the study and say this. I think what the moral implication is the moral choices I make, not just dietary and other stuff, but things that impact my health and well-being.
Smoking.
Smoking. I mean, sexual partners that I've had, all those things. That has an impact. Now, did I choose to have many or one?
Okay, gotcha. I thought you were confessing for.
No. No.
Just kidding.
To my wife, the answer is no.
No, I'm just kidding.
He's a troublemaker. That's why he's here. That's why you make the big bucks. So anyway,
whatever.
But just think about that, though.
No,
so
you're right.
You can't just go to a sperm bank and say, "Oh, what's the genetic? Oh, this is good genes, good stuff." But the question is, what kind of lifestyle choices was this person making? See, we don't know those things, and that's why these ideas that dads don't matter, and we're trying to get rid of the idea of any ideal of fatherhood,
and the notion
because those ideals impact the child.
And the notion that you're going to pass on your basketball genes to your kid or your basketball skills to your kid,
which I'm sure I have,
is not going to happen. I mean, Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson, their sons couldn't even make it into the league,
although in the NBA they say I think it's 50%
there's a lot of guys have some relative.
Have a relative.
Yeah,
it's interesting. But
but
there is more than just that.
There's more than just that. Yeah.
Because there's a lot of guys who are never going to make it.
Right.
Probably more than do.
Yeah. I had to turn down an NBA career.
I'm sure you did.
Yeah. I just decided not to pursue it.
Yeah.
They offered me.
The actual things with basketball, or is that a different NBA?
No, just a different NBA. Yeah.
National Beef Eaters.
Yeah. Association or
hey, want a career, just eat beef. It's
Yeah. Something. Yeah.
So here's another one. This is an interesting study. This is a different study. They're saying this: father's genes impact motherly love.
Oh, that's true.
But they're saying your genetics and epigenetics, essentially, impact the way a mother loves her child.
I would say yes.
What would you say, yes? Because I think that's to say that
but
in other words, how do your genes impact the way your wife Margie loved your children? Well, because you don't think that. I mean, you're not giving her genes necessarily.
No, but you think about it. Let's say you and your wife have a son. You do. You know how you were as a kid, right?
Yes.
You look at your son and you say, "Oh my gosh, that guy is just like me."
Yeah, but what this is saying, what this says is your genetics impact the way. So, Leroy,
I don't know how you know that. Yeah. I see what you're saying.
Let me get the study.
I don't see how.
Not just your choices, but listen to this. This is the research team. I know it might be, and it might be. I mean, there's time they got all these things. This is interesting. The research team has been investigating the hormonal signals given off from the placenta during pregnancy. The placenta transports nutrients to the growing fetus during pregnancy and gives off hormonal signals to the mother's bloodstream to establish and maintain a successful pregnancy. Important for pregnancy is mother's behavior, preparing them for the new role as parents. So they're saying these hormones impact just not the baby, but it sort of kicks in that maternal, they talk about the maternal instinct of how she's going to care. And I don't want to get into all the details.
Well, okay.
But this is saying, look, there's a gene.
Is it the husband? Is that the husband or is that the mom?
No, this is where the husband thing is. So the hormone that's produced by the placenta is controlled by a gene called like PHILDA. I guess it's like FILDA2 or something like that. I don't know how to say it. So there's a gene that controls that hormonal release. Now, in every gene, because there's a half DNA from that, there's like two alleles essentially.
Right.
And sometimes, in the case of this one, the father's side is turned off completely. The mother's side is not turned off in most cases. So anyway, what they did through this study, and they did it with mice, and then, you can say, how well is that applied to humans? So there's all these things got to be proven. But what I find interesting about that is the application is, what they did was they basically messed with those two genetic markers, those two alleles.
They did that with animals,
and they did it with mice. Yeah, they did it with mice. And what they found is that when the dad gene, sort of, so to speak, was turned up or turned on to function there, it impacted the nesting practices of the mother. So she did more nesting and less childcare. So she cleaned the house, so to speak. She did all the housework.
The rat.
Yeah, the rat cleaned up around more frequently than caring for the pups. When they turned it off and they did different balancing act, she cared more for the pups and did less nesting of the house.
Now, why is that, do you think? It seems
well, that's what's interesting. So they're saying basically the influence of the dad's genetics determine how much influence it can have an impact on the actual mothering things and choices at genetic level. I find it's fascinating.
It's interesting.
I think that's it because
I don't even know how to speculate on that.
Because here's what I think is, from a neo-Darwinian perspective, they think, oh, well, it's just all a function of our genes and our genes control everything, just finding a source. I don't think, as a Christian though, I think there's a marriage of those things. We're spiritual beings. We have a soul, and the soul communicates with our body, and those things interact. How that happens, nobody knows, but there's an interaction there. And God designed us as holistic beings. So I'm not opposed to, I don't think there's a biblical problem with recognizing that God designed us as holistic beings, that our genetics can have an influence on one another. In other words, the partner I choose when I chose my wife to be my wife, and she chose me, there's a part of us, not just spiritually to connect because we talk to each other on a social level. Mm-hmm. Genetically, there's also an impact on the way she will then function as a mom. And I think maybe through time we'll find out through the actual process, because there's a lot of studies now happening where we're really discussing this horizontal transfer of genes that happens more than no one ever realized how much. It's totally changed
lateral
the
transfer
genetics.
of genes.
Yeah. So
we just talked about that in one of our
And so what we're finding is that, and nobody's really studied this, so we don't know, but what about the possibility? This is how all science begins, is asking the questions. Is like, what about this actual process of sex for the purpose of reproduction? How much genetic information is swapped between man and woman, and how does that impact, does that impact the sort of volume control, so to speak, on my genes? Does that make me a better dad, the actual process of sexual reproduction? Does that make me and impact me to give me that fatherly instinct? We talk about a motherly instinct, but we don't even talk about that. So, that's what I find interesting. Because
that's an interesting question.
There's a more designed connection between those things than we're willing to allow for so far, because we just have never asked those questions. And as long as a purely naturalistic framework is the only way we do the scientific study, we won't ask those questions and really discover the connection. But these studies at least open up the possibility to, I think, from a Christian perspective, asking those questions and doing that. What do you think? I have one last one, but then this one.
No, that's very interesting. I mean, it is that could be one of the many reasons why there's a prohibition between having many partners in sex.
Well, that's exactly right. If God's saying an ideal is one man and one woman, it's not just a spiritual impact. There's an actual biological through our DNA, but also through epigenetics, possibly through lateral gene transference. I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying, is it not possible, since God designed us as holistic beings, that there's an impact? I remember years ago, I read a book by Josh McDowell when I was in college called Why Wait or something. And Why Wait was his book. And he talked about the actual process, the same muscles that are activated during, the act of sex. It's a good thing I did warn about this show, take the kids out of the room.
Sure.
But anyway, through the act of sex, those muscles, the vaginal muscles that are at play within that process are actually the same muscles that work similarly through that process of actually, pushing out the baby. Mm-hmm. So there's an intimacy that the mom has with her child, through, it's like, oh, this is just a baby. And all of a sudden, like, you'll talk to women and like, man, once I went through that, it's like my world changed, like that whole thing.
Dads will say the same thing.
And but this is there's an intimacy produced through the sexual process. It's, biologically something's happening in the muscles. It's those same muscles that sort of, when that process naturally occurs through birth, that same natural process of sex happens, there's an intimacy that's generated, I think, not just spiritually, but also biologically, is what I'm suggesting.
That's an interesting question.
And I think that's worth looking at. Here's the last one I'll mention, and then, because I think, and I'm trying not to get too much into the specific genetics and all that other kind of stuff, except to say that we need to see our lives holistically. Mm-hmm. This is an issue. This one goes from the mom side. The title of this one is Females' Eggs May Actively Select Certain Sperm. Subtitle, New Evidence Challenges the Oldest Law of Genetics. So if this study is true, again, the way we've understood genetics for the last 70 years, which has been genetics is a brand new, people don't realize how new genetics is. I mean, genetics is not it's not an old
It's not an
field
old
that's
field.
been around.
Right.
It's not an old science. It's a very new science. There's more that we don't know. There's by far more that we don't know than we do know. But this is fascinating because this is basically looking at the fact that historically what happens is people thought that, well, the strongest sperm gets into the egg.
Right.
And all the sort of, in a modern feminist concept, this patriarchal look at it. Because, and this might be true, because society looked at it as the man was in charge, no one ever bothered to study what role the egg might play in that process. So no one just bothered to even look at it. Just like I said, if you look at the world through a naturalistic, purely materialistic framework, you're not going to do studies that
answer that question.
That answer the questions I'm asking. So it's true in a totally patriarchal society that doesn't necessarily value the women's contribution. It's only going to do studies that look at the sperm's part in it.
Sure.
So since culture shifted, and in a way, maybe in a healthy way too, so now they're doing studies, say, what is the egg doing actively in that process? And this is what this study's saying, that, the egg actually plays an active role in the fertilization process, which no one ever thought of, no one ever knew before, because no one ever thought to ask. It says this, explanations could only conclude that fertilization wasn't random at all, which is the first thing that jumped out at me. See, because if you look at
Darwinian theory, it's always been portrayed as the first
survival of the fittest.
Survival of the fittest.
Exactly. It's
all others,
fertilization process
survive.
Strongest, the most fit sperm, just like the assumption within Darwinian evolution, the strongest survives. But now I'm saying, look, this isn't random at all. Ooh, that's one. I mean, especially when you look at who's this coming from. It's the gamete equivalent of choosing a partner. Now, the word choosing implies intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Which no one wants to give. Oh, we just give that thing to nature.
Sure.
But look at that. So think about that. It's not random. There's a choice being made. There's an actual process of choice within the egg, is what this scientist is saying. Not a Christian, right? There's not a Christian Science thing, but they're using these terminologies which tell us something more. It says this. His hypothesis for the researcher, and this is from Quantum magazine, by the way, if anyone looks at it. His hypothesis that the egg could woo sperm. Wow, look at that choice of words. The egg could actually woo and court sperm with specific genes and vice versa. Is part of a growing realization in biology that the egg is not the submissive, docile cell that science long thought it was. Instead, researchers now see the egg as an equal, an active player in reproduction, adding layers of, now it says, evolutionary control and selection to one of the most important processes of life. So you just throw in the word evolution, now it's a good study.
Now it's a scientific study.
Now it's a scientific study.
Right.
But he's saying, well, wait a second, but he just says evolutionary process does it. There's no way to show why that would be an evolution, why would evolution choose that, as opposed to why it's a design process. Well, so he's using all design features and intelligence features.
Yeah, because if the egg is choosing, then that's not natural selection. That's agency.
Yeah, well, listen to this one. Now, the randomness of fertilization is implicit in the principle of segregation, the first law of genetics going back to Gregor Mendel. Parents carry 2 copies of each genes, which are divided randomly to the gamete and carry on 1 copy. So I don't know who I was talking about. This study came to mind the other day. I actually think it was in the lecture we had last night you weren't a part of. But so Mendelian genetics is that, you get 2 sides. There's 25% chance of this option, 25%, you divide whatever those odds are based on if it's a dominant, recessive gene and all these other sort of things. But what the study is saying, that's really wrong. It's not based on that. That's not the percent, because that Mendel's genetics was the idea of did it on statistical randomness. This is the likelihood that this happens versus this happens, depending on the frequencies of genes and all those sort of things. And it's one of the most. I mean, it is one of these fundamental laws of genetics. But if this study is true, that fundamental law needs to be totally rewritten, if not eliminated potentially, because there's more to it than that genetics. He says we've been blinded by our perceptions. It's a different way to think about fertilization and very different implications about the process of fertilization. And that idea of blinded by perceptions is key, because he said the reason we haven't found this is because we haven't looked for it, what I said before. And so...
in 70 years.
Yeah, because no one thought that the woman would have any. Well, just look at the sperm. They're the ones in charge. They're the man side of things. So look at the woman's side of things. So think about that. Everything that he's saying in that study is everything that would, I as a Christian would argue, why we don't find often evidence that supports some of these other important answers to these questions. Because our even his own article where he's talking about blindness, he assumes that it's an evolutionary process without actually defining what that would even mean.
Right.
Because the truth is, everything else he says is the egg choice. The egg chooses. It's not passive. It's active. There's a courtship process. You know, and he's using all these words of intelligence to describe a random. But even though he says it's not random, evolution is defined by randomness. Mm-hmm. But he says that the process isn't random. But his framework doesn't allow it. But all these studies I'm putting together, and what I'm showing here is that, or what I'm trying to illustrate is that this idea of do dads matter? And does it matter what we say when we mean dad, fatherhood?
Sure.
It really matters. And I think there's evidence scientifically, biologically that it matters. Mm-hmm. Not just that dads donate and that they had a healthy, the
sperm donor.
Sort of, look, the perfect gene pool, you know, like kind of thing. There's epigenetic considerations impacted by lifestyle choices and the holistic nature of who we are as father. And the only answer, the only framework that boils that all together is one of intelligence, one of design, and one where God has created us, male and female, for a purpose and designed us as holistic beings.
And even our
spirit,
children,
mind, body, all those things.
And even our children are designed for a purpose. I mean, it is. You know, when I think of Acts 17, it's one of the great verses. It says, God chose the times and places for people to live in their pre-appointed boundaries so that they might find him. And it's not really until you really start to think about how deep this process is. So think about it. God chose the time and places for you to live in your pre-appointed boundaries. That means that God specifically chose the mom and dad that you would have, right? Mm-hmm. He chose the day that you would be born, because if you wait, if your mom and dad decide that they're going to get together at 12 o'clock and they wait until 6 o'clock in order for that to happen, then there's a whole new set of sperm in the man's DNA. So you don't even get the same set because that changes. So think about that.
And it changes also because of that journey. Like I said, epigenetically, that process changes not just who they are, but the choices you made within the last 2 weeks would impact the baby.
So think about that. That's just an astronomical way of thinking about it. And not only that, God chose the family you'd be born into, the country that you would be born into, the brothers and sisters that you would have, the life experiences that you would have, the crazy uncles and aunts that you have, and the crazy cousins.
And you don't mean that
I don't mean that in a negative way. I don't mean it in a deterministic way.
God, I had no choice, but I had, more control.
But
I'm just saying that.
No, but what I'm getting at is that God chose us so that we would find him, and that we would be his children. And that's everyone that is born. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just not, a certain, segment of the religious community. That's everyone. That's God's plan in action for every single one, because it says he chose our pre-appointed boundaries so that perhaps we might find him, even if we might grope for him. So the key thing is that no matter what our circumstances are, we're not here by accident.
Yeah.
We're not here in the circumstances that we're in by accident.
And our power as moms and dads to be a participant in that creation process, mm-hmm. to create new life, mm-hmm. is not just a spiritual choice. It's a biological choice. Mm. In other words, there's a biological thing when we live healthy, when we choose right things that, as a Christian, I would say, are in line with God's design for how he made us to be. When we mm-hmm. follow the owner's manual, so to speak. That has an impact on the life of the kids that we produce. I think that's mind-blowing.
That's a mind-blowing. It is a mind-blowing when you think of all the variables to produce one single person.
Yeah.
One person. And it actually tells you, I think, it gives you an indication of how God thinks about life, and how God thinks about the people that he's sown into the world, into the times that he's sown them into the world, into the places that he's sown them. That it's not flippant and it's not accidental. and it's not it's not willy-nilly, although we might feel that way at times. It's not that. God has a specific plan for every single person to be here. And it also indicates that those people who choose to, and I'm not trying to heap derision or scorn on the people who've chosen to terminate pregnancies, that they're thwarting something important, something that is not merely a close clumping or grouping of cells.
Yeah.
They're thwarting a life that God chose and wanted to be born.
See, and that's where these studies and the social experiments that we're going through, and answering, can we equally do it between no dad at home and, mom's dad, all those other kind of things. This is why those studies that don't consider the genetic influences, but also the spiritual realities of those things, are never going to be great studies, because there's a holistic framework.
There's something missing.
We have to undertake. There's always going to be a piece missing. But when our agenda is purely, again, through that naturalistic, materialistic framework, if that's all we think there is the material world, we don't consider those realities outside the physical as having an influence. But we need to.
Well, but think about it. What you just described in those papers are man's grappling with what, in each study, they're grappling with something that they think is absolutely amazing and awesome and mind-boggling, even more complex than they originally had thought.
Yeah.
But they missed the key point. If there is no God, and if there really is, their man really doesn't have any ultimacy to him, then so what? So what?
Yeah. It's just a process more complex than we thought. Huh?
Whatever. So what? What the doggone do? You know, you haven't said anything. But if God does exist, then
there's some
really
amazing. I'm fascinated by these stories. I mean, the last 2-3 weeks I've collected these things one at a time and just sort of like, interesting. But then I started seeing them all together, and I think there's a significant change in how we can see and how Christians need to argue for the nature of parenting and family, not just from a theological perspective, but from a biological and theological, married together, that we have just not even done before, because we've just not really even known to think of it that way, at least through specific data, like this in a genetic level. I think I don't know, I just think it's mind blowing. I'm excited to see where some of that will go and where those studies lead. But point is, Leroy, you matter. You matter as a dad. Well, I just wanted you to feel affirmed.
I know I matter. I mean, that reminds me of a certain basketball player when someone he said, I matter.
Yeah. Did you see that the Gary Smalley, the old Saturday Night Live skit with Gary Smalley? Yeah. I'm good enough. I'm smart enough.
And doggone people like me.
And did you see the one with Michael Jordan?
No, I didn't.
Oh yeah, go Google that. Michael Jordan, Gary Smalley. He's like, Michael, sometimes we don't feel good about ourselves. We don't feel confident in our abilities. It's like, so I want you to look at that mirror and say, I can bounce the ball. And Michael Jordan's looking in the mirror, looking at himself. It's like, he's trying not to laugh. Like, I can bounce the ball. It's like, now say, I can put it in the bucket. And he's just using non-term. People like me. Say it. And of course, he's Michael Jordan. So, and he's trying to give him these self-affirmation things.
That's funny.
When he's like the best in the world at the time. That's
great. Funny.
That's a great one. Google that. We'll close on that. So here's our first. Actually, our very first episode was on Periscope and Facebook. So now we've gone back to it. Hopefully, we'll get some feedback, hopefully, from people and see if this went well.
See what shakes out.
We'll see how it shakes out. We'll be back next week, Wednesday, though.
Wednesday, our normal time.
2 p.m. Pacific Coast time. Thank you.